When he learned about the autopsy, a 75-year-old grandfather broke into the morgue and poured this liquid into his granddaughters' mouths. By morning, the doctors were stunned. "God, this is terrifying," Grandpa Gus whispered, his voice trembling, his parched lips barely moving. "Even during my time in that high-security prison, I wasn't this scared." The words echoed faintly in the pitch-black, narrow passageway where every sound seemed amplified by the oppressive silence. Gus crawled forward, his frail body barely fitting through the confined space. His knees scraped against the rough, damp floor, and every movement sent a sharp ache through his aging joints. The stench was unbearable, a nauseating mix of decay and raw sewage that assaulted his senses. He gagged, pressing a sleeve to his nose, but the foul odour seemed to seep into his very pores. Cold, murky droplets of filthy water dripped from the ceiling, tracing icy paths down the back of his neck. He shivered violently but refused to stop. "Maybe this is my final thorny path in life," he thought, his weary mind swirling with both fear and resolve. "A one-way journey. I won't be coming back, but I have to do what I'm alive for. Here and now." He paused, pressing his forehead against the damp, clammy wall to steady himself, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "If someone had told me years ago that I'd end up crawling through icy pipes beneath a morgue," he muttered bitterly, "I'd have laughed and called them crazy. Hell, maybe I was the crazy one all along." The thought made him smirk despite himself, though it quickly faded. This wasn't the time for jokes. Not with the stakes this high. Gus pressed on, inch by grueling inch, his heart pounding not just from the effort, but from the urgency that burned within him. Tomorrow would be too late. He didn't have the luxury of walking through the morgue's front entrance like any normal person. No, tonight was his only chance. Each passing second felt like a punch to the chest, the weight of time bearing down on him like an unrelenting tide. He had traded dearly for this chance. A route into the morgue's basement, purchased from local vagrants for 3 bottles of whiskey. He could still hear the raspy laughter of the one who'd drawn the crude map. "Careful, old man," the vagrant had said with a crooked grin, his breath reeking of alcohol. "That place ain't just cold, it's cursed. You'll be crawling into the devil's lair." Gus had simply nodded and taken the map. Fear of curses didn't scare him. Not anymore. He had already lived through his own kind of hell. His goal was clear. The examination room. That cold, sterile space where his loved ones now lay. Loved ones he had only just discovered existed. Gus's mind swirled with the memory of the letter that had changed everything. A scrawled note on yellowed paper, delivered by a woman who had found it tucked inside an old Bible. "You have a son," it read. "And he had twin daughters. Their names are Daisy and Maisie." His hands had trembled as he read it, the ink smudged by the tears that fell freely down his weathered face. His son. Gone now for a decade, buried in the damp earth. But his granddaughters, they were alive. Or at least, he hoped they still were. A lump formed in his throat as he thought about them. The twins, 20 years old now. He'd never seen them, never held them, never been there to take them to school or tell them bedtime stories. "I didn't even know you existed," he whispered, his voice cracking in the darkness. "But if I can't change the past, maybe I can still change the future." Determined, Gus pushed forward, his fingers scraping against the slimy walls as he inched closer to his goal. The icy water soaked through his threadbare clothes, but he didn't care. The thought of Daisy and Maisie kept him moving. Even if they rejected him, even if they despised him for his absence, he needed to see them, to tell them he was sorry, and to beg their forgiveness before it was too late. But now everything had taken a cruel, merciless turn. Just this morning, Gus had hurried to meet them for the first time. 30 minutes late. That was all it took for fate to deal its brutal hand. The doctor's words struck him harder than any prison sentence he'd ever endured. The girls passed away 30 minutes ago from severe poisoning by a toxic substance, the young doctor said, his tone disturbingly detached. They'll remain in the morgue tonight, and tomorrow an autopsy will be conducted. Gus felt as though the ground had vanished beneath him. Ice coursed through his veins, leaving him paralyzed. He stared at the doctor, searching for even a hint of humanity in his expression, something to soften the blow of those devastating words. "Don't look at me like that," the doctor added indifferently, shrugging. "Everyone dies eventually, some sooner, some later. We're all mortal, after all." The words felt like a slap to Gus's already battered spirit. What could this young man possibly understand about the weight of loss, of regret, of a lifetime spent chasing redemption only to find the door slammed shut? Gus's mind screamed in anguish. He had spent the last few days planning to meet his granddaughters, rehearsing every word he'd say to them. And now he was here, but not to meet them. No. He had arrived at their funeral. "No," he whispered hoarsely to himself, his voice barely audible. "No, I can't live without them. I won't." Desperation surged through him like a tidal wave. He stepped closer to the doctor, his frail body trembling, but his eyes blazing with intensity. "You said they were poisoned," he said, his voice rising with each word. "What did you treat them with? Did you use an antidote? Tell me." The doctor hesitated, his composed facade faltering. His face flushed a deep red, and his hands twitched as he avoided Gus's piercing gaze. We did everything we could," he stammered, the words empty and lifeless. "I'm sorry, Mr. Patterson. There's nothing more we could do. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an urgent operation requiring my consultation." The doctor turned abruptly, walking briskly toward the door as though eager to escape the suffocating weight of Gus's grief. He didn't even bother to close the door behind him as he disappeared down the corridor. For a moment, Gus stood frozen, his mind a whirlwind of despair and anger. Then, like a spark in the darkness, an idea came to him. A desperate, reckless idea. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. He glanced up and down the corridor, his heart pounding. It was empty. The soft hum of fluorescent lights and the faint shuffle of distant footsteps were the only sounds. Taking a deep breath, Gus slipped into the doctor's office. His hands shook as he rifled through the cluttered desk. Medical reports, folders, scribbled notes. He scanned them frantically until he found what he was looking for: the file on Daisy and Maisie. Clutching the folder to his chest, Gus fled the hospital as fast as his legs would carry him. Every step felt like a battle, his old knees protesting with each hurried movement. But he didn't care. His body moved on instinct, driven not by logic but by the unrelenting force of his heart. "This isn't logical," he admitted to himself as he stumbled out into the cold night air. "But what has logic ever done for me? My girls need me. They're not gone. Not yet." By sheer luck, or perhaps fate, Gus had someone he could turn to: Pete Garrison, an old prison buddy who owed him more than a favor. Before his time in prison, Pete had been a toxicologist, an expert in crafting antidotes to some of the deadliest poisons known to man. His brilliance had been his undoing. A scandal involving an unauthorized experiment had landed him an 8-year sentence. But even in the harsh confines of prison, Pete had remained a spark of life and resilience. Gus had never forgotten his parting words when they'd been released. "If you ever need help, Gus, don't hesitate. I owe you more than I can ever repay." Now Gus needed him more than ever. Pete's small, cluttered apartment was nestled on a dingy street on the outskirts of town. Gus banged on the door with trembling hands, his breath hitching in his chest. It swung open moments later to reveal Pete, greying and gaunt, but still with the mischievous sparkle in his eye that Gus remembered so well. "Gus, old friend, what brings—" Pete's cheerful tone faltered as he took in Gus's dishevelled state. "Jesus, you look like hell. What happened?" Gus didn't bother with pleasantries. The words poured out of him in a frantic rush, his voice cracking under the weight of his despair. "It's my granddaughters, Pete. My granddaughters. They're all I have left in this God-forsaken world. And now they're—" He choked on the words, tears streaming down his weathered face. Pete gently guided him inside, shutting the door behind them. "Take a breath, Gus. Start from the beginning." Gus sank into an old armchair, clutching the medical reports tightly to his chest. With halting breaths, he recounted the story, the poisoning, the doctor's detached words, the morgue. "No, Pete, I can't live without those girls," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "If I don't ask for their forgiveness, if I don't tell them I'm sorry, I'll go straight to hell. I can't let this be the end. I won't." Pete placed a steadying hand on Gus's shoulder as the old man broke down completely. Gus had endured a lifetime of pain and regret, but this was different. This was a torment so deep it threatened to shatter him. When Gus's sobs subsided, he looked up at Pete, his eyes red and swollen. "The doctors say they're gone, that they were poisoned, but I don't believe it. They're wrong. I can feel it. Please, Pete, you're the only one who can help me." Pete studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a small, reassuring smile, he said, "Don't panic, pal. If there's a chance, we'll take it. You know I've always liked a challenge." Pete took the medical reports from Gus's trembling hands and began examining them with the sharp eye of a seasoned expert. He muttered to himself as he flipped through the pages, occasionally pausing to scribble notes on a scrap of paper. Gus sat on the edge of his seat, his heart pounding like a war drum. Finally, Pete looked up, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Okay," he said, his voice calm but decisive. "It looks like they were exposed to a specific neurotoxin. Nasty stuff, but not unbeatable. The window's tight, though. How long ago did this happen?" "About 4 hours," Gus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Pete nodded grimly. "Then we don't have a second to waste." He disappeared into the depths of his apartment, rummaging through shelves and cabinets that were crammed with vials, beakers, and jars of unlabeled substances. Gus sat in tense silence, listening to the clinking of glass and the rustle of papers. Minutes later, Pete emerged holding a small vial of clear liquid. He handed it to Gus with steady hands. "Here, take this," Pete said, his tone confident and unwavering. "This antidote should work for their kind of poisoning. But listen to me carefully, Gus. You only have 8 hours. After that, it'll be too late, even for this." Gus stared at the vial as though it held the key to salvation. His hands shook as he cradled it, his mind racing. 8 hours, he repeated, his voice hoarse. "What do I do?" Pete grabbed a scrap of paper and scribbled down instructions. "You need to get to them fast. Administer this intramuscularly, straight into the thigh. Make sure they're lying down and watch for seizures as it takes effect. It won't be easy, but you've got to trust me." Gus looked up at Pete, tears glistening in his eyes. "Thank you, Pete. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for this." Pete smirked, the mischievous glint in his eye returning. "Don't mention it, old man. You saved my hide more than once back in the day. Let's just call it even." Gus nodded, clutching the vial tightly as he rose to his feet. He had no time to lose. His heart was heavy with fear. But for the first time in hours, a flicker of hope ignited within him. "Wish me luck," he said, heading for the door. Grandpa Gus clung to Pete's words with unwavering faith, repeating them like a mantra as he crawled through the suffocating maze of pipes beneath the morgue. 8 hours, you've got 8 hours. Move, Gus, move, he urged himself, his voice echoing faintly in the confined space. His body screamed for rest. His arms and legs trembled with exhaustion, threatening to give out with every pull forward. Each breath was a struggle rasping against his lungs like sandpaper. The world felt like it was closing in around him, the air thick and stifling. But Gus wouldn't stop. He couldn't. The vision of Daisy and Maisie, their young faces etched in his mind, spurred him on. Time is slipping away, he thought. I can't waste it. Not when my girls are waiting for me. Not when I'm so close. His strength waned, his movements growing slower, more laboured. He felt as though the curtain of life might fall on him at any moment, but the thought of performing a miracle, of bringing his granddaughters back to life, lit a fire in his heart. It was a warmth that defied the bitter cold of the pipes, a hope so fierce it kept him moving despite the odds. Then, out of the suffocating darkness, a dim light appeared ahead. Gus froze, his heart skipping a beat. He blinked, almost disbelieving, before crawling forward with renewed vigour. With every strained movement, the light grew brighter, sharper, until it filled the narrow tunnel with a faint glow. "Dear God," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Finally. Forgive me for my trespasses, but I made it. I did it." His knees scraped against the metal grate as he pushed through the opening. Moments later, his feet touched the cold, smooth floor of the morgue. The icy chill seeped through his thin soles, but he barely noticed. His trembling, bruised hands fumbled as he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out the small vial Pete had entrusted to him. It was intact. A miracle. Gus clutched it to his chest, his heart pounding. This is it, he thought, the enormity of the moment sinking in. The morgue was silent, the air thick with a chill that seemed to press against his skin. Rows of metal tables gleamed under the sterile light, flanked by refrigeration units humming softly. "It's so cold and frightening," Gus thought as he crept between the tables, each step echoing in the vast, empty space. How many lives ended here, snuffed out by death? How many families wept for those lying in this room? Then his eyes fell upon them. "There they are," he whispered, his voice breaking. "My beautiful swans. So alike." The twins lay side by side on a single metal table, their blonde hair spread out like halos against the stark surface. Their faces were serene, untouched by the harshness of death. "They don't look dead," Gus said aloud, his words trembling with fragile hope. "They're alive. Of course they are. The doctors made a mistake, but that's okay. I'll save you. I'll bring you back." Gus approached them slowly, his hands trembling as he reached out. He ran his fingers through their soft hair, his touch reverent, as though afraid they might vanish if he pressed too hard. He leaned down, resting his wrinkled cheek against their cold, pale faces. "You're here," he murmured. "Grandpa's here now. I'm sorry I was late. I'm sorry I didn't find you sooner. But I'll make it right. I'll make it right." Fumbling, Gus uncapped the vial, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. Carefully, he poured the antidote into each of their mouths one by one, his voice a soft, unsteady murmur. "There you go, my sweet girls," he said, brushing a stray strand of hair from Maisie's face. "This antidote will work. It has to work. You'll live. We'll see each other again, and I'll tell you everything. Maybe one day you'll forgive an old man like me." He stepped back, his eyes fixed on their still forms, searching for any sign of movement, a flutter of an eyelid, the twitch of a finger, the rise and fall of their chests. But there was nothing. They lay as still as sleeping princesses, their chests unmoving, their hands limp by their sides. The silence of the room pressed down on Gus like a crushing weight. And yet, Gus believed. He had to believe. "It's just the beginning," he whispered, sinking into a nearby chair. His eyes never left their faces, filled with a hope so fierce it refused to waver. "You'll wake up. You will. I know you will." Time stretched on like an eternity as Gus sat beside them, his tearful eyes locked on their still pale faces. He clutched the edge of the metal table, his knuckles white as if his sheer will alone could pull them back to life. "Maisie, Daisy," he murmured, his voice cracking under the weight of his grief. "How could this happen? How could you be poisoned and brought to the brink of death? What kind of world does this to such beautiful souls?" He'd asked himself that same question 100 times, and every time he was met with the same agonizing silence. Suddenly, a booming voice cut through the stillness, jolting him from his thoughts. "Who's there?" Gus's heart leapt into his throat. He instinctively ducked behind a large grey refrigeration unit, pressing himself against the cold metal. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he peered out cautiously. A man in uniform, a morgue security guard, was making his rounds, his flashlight beam cutting through the dim light of the room. Did he hear me? Gus thought, panic clawing at his chest. Or is he just checking the place? The guard stepped closer, his boots echoing ominously against the tiled floor. "Come out, or I'll call the police!" the man barked, his voice sharp and commanding. The word police sent an icy shiver down Gus's spine. Even after all these years, it still carried the weight of dread and despair. Prison had taken a decade of his life, and it had left scars far deeper than the ones on his skin. Another stint behind bars would break him entirely, and worse, it would mean losing his granddaughters forever. I can't let that happen, Gus thought, his pulse pounding in his ears. He held his breath as the guard's footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, just as quickly, they began to fade. Gus craned his neck and saw the guard stepping outside for a smoke, leaving the heavy door ajar behind him. This was his chance. With his heart hammering in his chest, Gus slipped out from behind the unit and moved silently toward the exit. Every creak of the floor felt deafening in the silence, but the guard didn't turn. The cool night air hit his face as he slipped through the door and into the darkness beyond. The pitch-black streets offered little solace. The cold seemed to seep into his bones, and the weight of his exhaustion threatened to pull him to the ground. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. He stumbled to a crumbling fence near the morgue, his legs finally giving out beneath him. Leaning against the rusted metal, he tried to catch his breath, his chest heaving with the effort. From inside the morgue, a sharp bark pierced the quiet night. Gus froze, his blood running cold. The guard's dog. He had to move. Summoning what little strength he had left, Gus pushed himself to his feet and staggered down the street, the darkened buildings blurring past him. Even as the morgue faded into the distance, his heart refused to calm. The ache in his chest wasn't just from exhaustion. It was the searing pain of uncertainty. He wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers from the universe, but he bit it back. I've done all I can, he told himself, though the words felt hollow. Now it's up to God, or fate, or whatever power rules this cruel world. Meanwhile, back at the morgue, the silence of early morning was shattered. A muffled cry came from one of the workers. Oh my God, did you see that? They're breathing. The identical sisters lay motionless no longer. Their chests rose and fell faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if they were taking their first tentative steps back into the world of the living. Their fingers twitched, their pale hands curling slightly as though grasping for something unseen. But their eyes remained closed, their expressions still and serene. They seemed caught in a liminal space, somewhere between life and death, a fragile state that could tip either way at any moment. What's happening? Someone whispered, their voice tinged with awe and fear. The room buzzed with shock and confusion. Medical staff scrambled to understand what they were witnessing. Such occurrences were rare, anomalies, mistakes by doctors, or acts of divine intervention. No one could have guessed the truth. The higher power that had brought these girls back wasn't divine at all. It was Grandpa Gus, an old man with trembling hands, a heart full of hope, and an unrelenting belief that love could defy even the cold hand of death. At that very moment, Gus felt it, a powerful, overwhelming sensation, as if an unseen force had jolted through his body. Something had happened, something miraculous. He stopped dead in his tracks, his heart racing. What was that? He whispered, clutching his chest. His mind raced with possibilities. Then it hit him, clear as day. Of course, Gus! What a silly question! His inner voice exclaimed. The hospital, that's where your girls are now. Without a second thought, Gus set off toward the hospital, his tired legs finding new strength. "I'll be there soon," he murmured, weaving through the darkened streets. "I'll walk into their room, hug my girls, and never let them go again." In his mind, he soared into a hopeful future, a future where Daisy and Maisie laughed with him, shared stories and forgave him for his absence, but the harshness of reality wasn't far behind, tugging him back to the present. As Gus stepped into the hospital room, his breath caught in his throat. The sight before him overwhelmed him with emotion. "Thank God," he whispered, his voice shaking. "They're alive. They're no longer lying in that cold morgue among those preparing for their final journey. They're pale, covered in wires and tubes, but they're alive." Tears welled in his eyes as he approached the twin beds. His trembling hands reached out, taking each of their hands in his own. Warmth. Their hands were warm, not the icy cold he'd feared. Life, though faint, pulsed within them. "Pete's antidote worked!" Gus rejoiced silently, his heart swelling with relief and gratitude, but as quickly as hope surged, it faltered. "Why aren't they waking up?" he murmured, his brow furrowed with concern. He leaned closer, searching their faces for any sign of consciousness. "Why don't they open their eyes?" The room remained silent, save for the steady beeping of the monitors. The girls' eyelids stayed tightly shut, their chests rising and falling rhythmically, as if trapped in an unending dream. The door creaked open, breaking the stillness. In walked Dr. William Evers, a grey-haired physician with a calm yet solemn demeanour. He glanced at Gus, who looked at him with desperate, pleading eyes. "Unfortunately, the girls are in a coma," Dr. Evers said, his voice steady but clinical. "This can happen due to severe physical exhaustion and the stress caused by the poisoning. The body shuts down to protect itself while it recovers. We're running further tests to understand the full extent of their condition." "In a coma?" Gus repeated, his voice trembling. His mind reeled. He had endured countless hardships in his life, but nothing prepared him for this. "How can you say that so coldly? Are they dying? Look at them. They're so pale, and you're just standing there, doing nothing." Dr. Evers took a step closer, his expression softening. "I understand how difficult this is for you, Mr. Patterson, but I assure you, we're doing everything we can. Their lives aren't in immediate danger. Think of it as a deep sleep, the body's way of healing. They'll wake up soon." Gus stared at him, his mind grappling with the doctor's words. He wanted to believe him, but fear and doubt gnawed at his heart. "How long will they stay like this?" Gus finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Evers hesitated, the weight of the question evident on his face. "No one can say for sure," he admitted. "It could be 2 days, a month, or even a year." "A year?" Gus gasped, the words hitting him like a physical blow. His throat tightened, and he felt a lump rising, threatening to choke him. Dr. Evers placed a hand on Gus's shoulder. "I know it's hard, but you must stay strong for them. They need you now more than ever." Without waiting for a response, the doctor stepped back. "I have to attend to other patients. If you need anything, the nurse on duty will assist you." He left the room quietly, the door clicking shut behind him. Dr. Evers truly pitied Gus. The old man's journey through heartbreak to this moment was nothing short of harrowing. The twins had been mistakenly sent to the morgue, only to be discovered alive and placed in a coma. A cruel chain of events that would shatter most. Dr. Evers withheld the darker possibilities of prolonged unconsciousness, irreversible consequences that loomed silently, fearing it would crush the fragile hope Gus clung to. But Gus wasn't naive. He could see the unease in the doctor's eyes, feel the hesitance in his voice. A wave of dread washed over him, as heavy as the years he had borne in silence. Tears streamed freely down his weathered face as he stepped toward the hospital beds. Daisy and Maisie lay peacefully, their chests rising and falling faintly, their faces untouched by the struggles raging within their bodies. Gus leaned close, searching desperately for the faintest sign of life, a flutter of an eyelid, a twitch of a finger, anything. But nothing changed. "My sweet girls," he whispered, his voice trembling. "My beautiful swans, my sleeping princesses. What am I supposed to do now?" His words faltered as he stared at their youthful faces, so still yet so full of life. Powerless, he threw up his hands in despair. "I won't live to see the day you wake up. I won't." His voice broke, thick with sorrow. "But you need to know. I'm your grandfather, even though you've never seen me. And before I leave this world, I have to tell you my story. I need to beg for your forgiveness, just as I would before God." Gus clutched their hands gently, his voice soft but filled with conviction. He believed with all his heart that the girls could hear him. That belief was his lifeline now, the only thread keeping him tethered to hope. "I once had everything," he began, his tone tinged with bittersweet nostalgia. "Everything a man needs to be happy. My wife, Mary, beautiful as a rose. We had a warm home, a thriving business. Life was good, or at least, it seemed that way. But trouble was already lurking at the gates." He paused, his grip tightening slightly as he drew strength from the warmth of their hands. "One day, my childhood friend, Jimmy, came to me for help. We'd grown up together. He was harmless, cheerful, the kind of kid everyone liked. As we got older, he became a fine man, strong and clever. Or so I thought. Jimmy came to me and said, 'Gus, I need a favor. My mother's sick and her treatment is expensive. I don't have the money. Please, let me work for you.' Gus's voice softened, his gaze distant. How could I say no? I took pity on him. I hired him. I trusted him. Over time, I even made him my deputy." A bitter laugh escaped his lips, sharp and raw. "But it turns out I had warmed a snake in my bosom. My own kindness betrayed me. Jimmy set me up, framed me for bribery and falsifying financial records. They sent me to prison for 10 long years. 10 years, girls," he said, his voice cracking. "But I swear to God, I never did those things. Never." Gus choked on the words, his tears falling faster now, blurring his vision like a thick fog. The memories clawed at him, dragging him back to those cold, unrelenting prison walls. As Gus wiped his tears and took a deep, shaky breath, he forced himself to continue. The room felt heavier now, filled with the weight of his memories and unspoken pain. "While I rotted in prison, Jimmy thrived," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "He took over my business, my entire life. Everything I built, everything I worked for, it all became his. And not just that." Gus's hands clenched into fists as the words caught in his throat. He swallowed hard before continuing. "While I was locked up, my wife, Mary, never sent me a single letter, not one. Every day I waited, hoping, praying for something, anything, but nothing ever came. I told myself maybe she couldn't write. Maybe she didn't know where to send it. Stupid excuses, I see that now." His voice cracked, his raw emotions spilling out. "But eventually I got a letter. It wasn't from her, though. It was from Jimmy." Gus let out a hollow laugh, his tone bitter and pained. "And what did he send me? Divorce papers?" He fell silent for a moment, his gaze dropping to the floor. His trembling hands gripped the edge of the bed. "From that moment on," he continued, his voice low and tight, "she was dead to me. I could forgive a lot, girls, but not betrayal. Never betrayal. Later, I found out she married Jimmy." He shook his head, the memory still cutting deep. "Makes sense, doesn't it? A convict was no use to her. Jimmy was the winner. I was the loser. End of story." Gus's voice faltered, his words heavy with bitterness and heartbreak. The memories clawed at him, but he forced himself to press on. "I served every damn day of my sentence, 10 years, start to finish. When I finally got out, my heart was empty and my pockets were too. I was a free man, sure, but I had nothing. No home, no family, no hope. I couldn't rebuild my life. How could I? All I could do was scrape by. He paused, letting out a long, weary sigh. I spent the rest of my years working as a night watchman, just enough to keep a roof over my head and food in my stomach. I never remarried, never started a new family. That would have been the end of my story if not for... Gus's voice wavered, and his throat tightened. His gaze drifted to the girls, their still forms giving him both solace and strength. "A month ago," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I got a letter. It was from Mary." He closed his eyes, the memory of that day cutting through him like a knife. "She wrote to tell me she was dying," he continued. "She said she wanted to confess before her death. I almost threw it away when I saw her name on the envelope, but I couldn't. Her confession was cruel, girls. It was heartbreaking." His voice broke again, but he pushed through. "She wrote that her whole family was gone. None of them remained. Her husband, George, died in a car accident 2 years ago. And then she wrote something that completely shattered me." Gus's hands trembled as he gripped the girl's hands tighter, drawing strength from their warmth. His voice dropped to a whisper heavy with emotion. "The son Mary claimed was George's, was actually mine," he said, the words feeling surreal even now. "She wrote that she'd kept the truth from me out of guilt, said she didn't want me to know while I was in prison." He let out a shaky breath. "She enclosed proof, a yellow document confirming George's infertility, and a photograph of the boy. My son." Gus's voice softened as his tears flowed freely. "A spitting image of me." A storm of emotions swirled within him. Anger, hatred, betrayal, emotions he'd held on to for so long. But now there was something else, something stronger. "I hated her for keeping that from me," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I hated her for lying, for stealing my chance to know my son. But..." He paused, a faint smile breaking through his anguish. "I was happy," Gus continued, his voice trembling, "even in my old age, to learn I had a son. For the first time in decades, I felt whole. Like life had given me a reason to keep going, but my happiness was fleeting. Gone in an instant." He paused, his weathered face clouding with grief. "Mary wrote that our son had died," he said, his voice breaking. "A heart attack, gone before I even knew he existed. And his wife, Anna. She'd passed long ago. She died giving birth to their twin daughters, to you." Gus let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his words. His life had been a relentless series of hardships, but despite it all he had felt, just for a moment, that God had finally rewarded him. Now, as he sat by his granddaughters, his lips moved in silent prayer, words of gratitude flowing from his heart despite his sorrow. "It's just us now," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You and me, my granddaughters, the daughters of my son. If you live, so will I. But if you don't, I'll have no reason to go on." His voice faded into silence, the room filled only with the faint hum of machines and the rhythmic beeping of monitors. Gus retreated into his thoughts, his confession hanging heavy in the air. 10 minutes. That's all it had taken to encapsulate a lifetime of burdens and sorrows, a lifetime of regrets and loss. For a long while he sat by the girls, their hands cradled gently in his own. His lips moved in fervent prayer, pleading for them to wake up, to open their eyes and see him. But his prayers went unanswered. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his guilt. "Please forgive this old man for not being there when you needed me." He leaned forward, bowing his head over one of their hands. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down his cheek and dripping onto the hospital blanket. Then, in the stillness of the room, Gus felt it, a faint, almost imperceptible squeeze on his hand. His head shot up, his heart pounding in his chest. Maybe I imagined it, he thought, his mind racing. But desperation pushed the doubt aside. "Can you hear me?" he cried, his voice trembling with hope. "Give me a sign." To his astonishment, the girl's fingers squeezed his hand again and again. "Maisie!" Gus shouted, his voice breaking with joy. He turned to the other bed, grabbing his second granddaughter's hand. "What about you, Daisy? Did you hear me? Answer me." For a moment the room was still. Then, to his immense joy, the second girl's fingers squeezed his hand as well. Gus let out a choked laugh, tears streaming down his face. "You're here?" he whispered. "You're really here?" Overcome with happiness, Gus began pacing the room like a man possessed. His age, his weak heart, the crushing weight of his past mistakes, none of it mattered now. All that mattered was the miracle unfolding before him. "Thank you, God," he muttered, his hands clasped together. "Thank you." He turned back to the girls, his voice trembling with emotion. "You're alive," he whispered. "You're alive, and you're fighting. My precious girls, you're fighting." Unable to contain himself, Gus dashed out of the room, his legs moving with a vigor he hadn't felt in years. His eyes darted around the hallway, searching desperately for Dr. Evers. "Dr. Evers!" Gus called, his voice echoing through the corridor. "Dr. Evers, wait!" Dr. Everett turned, surprised to see the elderly man everyone in the hospital, and indeed the entire small town, had been talking about. News of the twins who had been mistakenly sent to the morgue, only to be found alive, had spread like wildfire. Gus had become somewhat of a local legend overnight. "What is it, Gus?" Dr. Everett asked, his tone laced with curiosity and concern. "My granddaughters, they're waking up!" Gus exclaimed, his voice trembling with equal parts excitement and urgency. "Are you sure? Let's check," the doctor said, his professional demeanor giving way to hurried steps as he followed Gus back to the room. Inside, the doctor carefully examined the girls, checking their vitals and observing the faint but unmistakable movements of their fingers. Finally, he turned to Gus with a smile. "It's true," Dr. Everett said, his voice warm. "Their condition is improving. This is incredible. Let's hope they fully regain consciousness soon. Once that happens, a full recovery is well within reach." He placed a hand on Gus's shoulder. "Gus, you're amazing. I don't think there's a better grandfather anywhere." Hearing those words, Gus's heart swelled with pride. To be called grandfather was the greatest joy he could imagine. "But," the doctor continued, his tone shifting, "you need to take care of yourself too. You've been through so much. You need rest." "No," Gus replied firmly, his voice unwavering. "I need to see my girls recover. I'll rest in the next life." The doctor sighed, recognizing the determination in Gus's eyes. "All right, just don't push yourself too hard." Gus was genuinely happy. Each day the twins grew stronger. Though their eyes remained closed, the faint movements of their hands and the steady rise and fall of their chests filled him with hope. It seemed as if, at any moment, they would open their eyes, speak, and fill the room with their voices, soft, musical, like babbling brooks, soothing his weary soul. That Sunday was no different. The day was warm, filled with a quiet hope that made Gus feel as though nothing could go wrong. For him, there was no room in his heart for dark thoughts or fear. As evening approached, Gus leaned over the girls' beds, his voice tender. "I'm just going to get some water, my sweet girls. I'll be right back." He grabbed a pitcher from the bedside table and stepped out, humming softly to himself. But as he walked back toward the room, a sudden unease washed over him. His heart began to ache, a deep instinctive pain that made his steps falter. He quickened his pace, his grip tightening on the pitcher. The moment Gus stepped into the room, he froze. His breath caught in his throat, and the pitcher slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. Over the girls' bed stood a large figure dressed in black, silhouetted against the dim light of the room. The man's gloved hand gripped a gleaming object, a knife raised high, poised to strike. "Who are you? What are you doing?" Gus shouted, his voice trembling with both fear and fury. "Don't you dare touch them! Don't you dare!" The figure turned sharply, startled by Gus's sudden presence. The black mask on his face shifted slightly, revealing darting, furious eyes. Gus's heart pounded as he stared into those eyes, a mixture of rage and desperation flooding his chest. Quickly regaining his composure, the intruder leapt toward Gus. In a low, menacing voice, he hissed in the old man's ear, "You don't get to ask questions, old man." Before Gus could react, a sharp, blinding pain exploded in his head. The intruder had struck him hard, and Gus collapsed to the floor, his body crumpling like a broken doll. Pain radiated from his chest as his vision blurred, the world spinning wildly around him. He tried to move, to shout, but his body refused to obey. Darkness crept in at the edges of his vision, swallowing him whole. The last thing Gus heard before unconsciousness claimed him was the faint, rhythmic beeping of the monitors, the sound of life continuing, even as his own began to fade. In the few fleeting seconds before Gus's head touched the floor, his entire life flashed before his eyes, a vivid, unrelenting reel of memories. There he was, a little boy, barefoot and wide-eyed, clinging to his mother's dress as they walked through a dusty village street. He saw her smile, warm and loving, as she congratulated him for earning a perfect score on his school exam. Then came the image of a young man, sleepless and determined, poring over textbooks late into the night at university, dreaming of a brighter future. The memories shifted, building a business from scratch, the pride of seeing his hard work flourish, marrying Mary, the love of his life, and holding her close during their happiest days. Then, the darker times. The sting of betrayal as his trusted friend Jimmy framed him, the cold, relentless despair of prison walls, and the heartbreaking discovery of Mary's infidelity. He saw himself as a recluse, working long hours for pennies, his shoulders heavy with the weight of a broken spirit. Then, the brightest moment of all, a golden light amid the darkness, finding his family, discovering his son and granddaughters, and feeling an immeasurable happiness he thought was lost forever. And then, darkness. Endless, all-encompassing darkness. "Such a pity about the old man," Dr. Victor Everett said the next day, his voice heavy with regret. "He's suffered a severe stroke. At his age, it's unlikely he'll recover." "What happened, Dr. Everett?" asked Nurse Laura, her face etched with concern. "A stroke, compounded by pre-existing heart issues," Victor explained, his tone grim. "The right side of his body is partially paralyzed and his speech is impaired. The prognosis is poor. Full recovery is highly unlikely." As Victor addressed the worried hospital staff, a storm of frustration brewed within him. His normally composed demeanor cracked as anger seeped into his words. "Laura, tell me," Victor said sharply, his piercing gaze locking onto the nurse. "It was your shift. Why weren't you at your post when the man in black stormed into the twins' room?" Laura's face turned pale, her voice trembling. I only stepped away for a minute," she stammered. "I'm so sorry, Dr. Everett." "Sorry?" Victor's voice rose, his anger spilling over. "You were responsible for their safety, and now an intruder nearly succeeded in harming them, and Gus, under your watch." Laura flushed crimson, her hands trembling. She opened her mouth to respond, but Victor turned away, his fists clenching at his sides. A moment later, guilt washed over him. Blaming Laura wasn't entirely fair, he realized. The hospital's security had failed as well. Surveillance cameras had captured only the fleeting silhouette of the intruder disappearing into the night, no face, no clear features, just a shadow. Victor exhaled deeply, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Why does he get away scot-free?" he muttered bitterly to himself. "And why did he come here? What was he trying to do to those twins?" The questions swirled chaotically in his mind, unanswered and unsettling. Then a chilling thought struck him. He wanted to get rid of the twins, Victor whispered, his voice trembling. And Gus. Gus was just an unlucky witness. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Gus's unwavering devotion to his granddaughters had left an indelible mark on Victor. The old man had fought so hard, only to be struck down while trying to protect them. I have to uncover the truth, Victor resolved aloud. I owe it to him, to those girls. Making that promise was the easy part. Fulfilling it seemed nearly impossible. The odds were stacked against them, with little evidence and an assailant who had vanished into the shadows. But Victor knew where to start. Among his acquaintances was Detective Sam Barrett, a seasoned investigator who owed him a favour. Years ago, Victor had saved Sam's son during a life-threatening surgery. That kind of gratitude, Victor hoped, wouldn't be forgotten. With renewed determination, Victor grabbed his coat and strode toward the exit. He'll help me, Victor thought, his mind set on the task ahead. Without wasting another moment, he headed straight to the police station, a storm of resolve brewing in his chest. Inside the recently renovated police station, it was unusually quiet. The faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the air, interrupted only by the occasional shuffle of papers and the muffled voices of officers. Victor Everett sat in the waiting area, visibly restless. The on-duty officer at the front desk occasionally glanced his way, more out of boredom than curiosity. Victor checked his watch for the 5th time in 10 minutes, shifting in his seat. Sam Barrett, the detective he'd come to see, was out on a case, and time was running short. Victor needed to get back to the hospital. Just as Victor stood, ready to leave, the station doors swung open. Sam entered, his jacket slung over one shoulder, looking worn from a long day in the field. "Sam!" Victor called, relief washing over him as he hurried to meet the detective. "Victor," Sam said, surprised. "It's been a while. What brings you here? You look like you've got something serious on your mind." "More than you know," Victor replied. "Let's talk in your office. I need your help." Sam nodded, leading the way to a modest office cluttered with files and case notes. The two men sat, and Victor began recounting the strange and tragic story of Gus and the twins. As Victor spoke, Sam's expression darkened, his brows furrowing deeper with each detail. When Victor finished, Sam leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. "This needs to be investigated immediately," he said firmly. "I'll take the case." True to his word, Sam dove into the investigation with relentless determination. Within 2 weeks, he had cracked the case, uncovering a web of greed and betrayal that left Victor both horrified and furious. The culprit was identified: Anthony, the adopted son of George from his first marriage. Despite George's efforts to reform him, Anthony had inherited the worst traits of his biological parents, both alcoholics whose neglect had landed him in foster care. As a child, Anthony displayed troubling behavior, often clashing with authority figures. By his teenage years, he was a regular in juvenile detention centers. At 18, Anthony committed his first robbery and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. His criminal record grew steadily from there, with a string of thefts, assaults, and scams. He spent nearly half his life behind bars, showing little remorse or desire to change. When George, his second wife, and several other relatives passed away, Anthony saw a golden opportunity. "Why shouldn't I inherit George's business and his 2 luxury apartments?" Anthony thought, bitterness fueling his ambition. But there was a problem. The twins, Daisy and Maisie, as George's biological granddaughters, were the rightful heirs. For Anthony, their existence was an obstacle to his plans. To claim everything, Anthony realized, I need to get rid of them. But how can I do it without ending up back in prison? His criminal mind worked overtime, devising a plan. He decided to use charm and cunning instead of brute force. Anthony tracked Daisy and Maisie to a popular cafe where they often went after their college classes. Posing as a kind and generous stranger, He approached them with a carefully rehearsed act. "Ladies," Anthony said, flashing a warm, disarming smile, "today's my birthday. I'm all alone with no one to celebrate with. Join me. Don't worry, you don't have to go anywhere. We'll celebrate right here at the cafe. What do you say?" Daisy and Maisie exchanged a glance, taken aback by the boldness of this older man. They were naturally cautious, but both loved adventures and new experiences. After a brief hesitation, they agreed. "But we don't drink alcohol," they said in unison, their voices carrying a polite firmness. Anthony didn't miss a beat, as if he had anticipated their response. "No problem at all," he said, his tone light and cheerful. "How about some juice instead? Something fruity and fun. It'll be a proper celebration without the booze." The evening passed pleasantly for Daisy and Maisie. The charming stranger's unexpected invitation had been an unusual but enjoyable diversion, and they returned home late, chatting about the day and feeling satisfied with how they had spent their time. But the joy of the evening quickly turned to horror. In the dead of night, Maisie suddenly fell ill. Pain ripped through her body with such intensity that she couldn't even cry out. Her hands clawed at the air as she collapsed to the floor, her body convulsing violently. Foam formed at her mouth, and her breathing became ragged. "Maisie, are you okay?" Daisy shouted, jolted awake by the commotion. She rushed to her sister's side, her heart pounding as she knelt next to Maisie. The sight before her was horrifying. "Stay with me, Maisie," Daisy cried, tears streaming down her face. "I'm calling for help." But before she could act, Daisy felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her own stomach. It was as if fire coursed through her veins. Her vision blurred, and her limbs began to tremble uncontrollably. The pain overwhelmed her, but with her last ounce of strength, she reached for her phone and dialed 911. "Help," she whispered hoarsely before losing consciousness. When the paramedics arrived, they had to break down the door to enter. The scene that greeted them was grim. Both sisters lay unconscious on the floor, their bodies lifeless and pale. 40 minutes later, at the hospital, a grim pronouncement was made. "Time of death, 3:17 a.m., the doctor said, his voice heavy with finality. Anthony, calculating and ruthless, was certain his plan had succeeded. When news of the twins' deaths reached him, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. "Now, nothing stands in my way," he thought, but his triumph was short-lived. Days later, Anthony's fury ignited when he learned that the twins had been found alive and transported to the hospital's morgue by mistake. Even more enraging was the discovery that an elderly man, Gus, had intervened, saving their lives against all odds. Fueled by greed and madness, Anthony devised another plan. He would finish what he had started, this time at the hospital, where he was certain no one could stop him. But once again, Grandpa Gus stood in his way. Anthony's rage reached its boiling point as he confronted Gus in the hospital room. "You'll get what's coming to you, old man," Anthony snarled, shoving Gus to the ground with all his strength. "I'll break you like a twig once and for all." Gus collapsed, pain radiating through his body. His head spun and his chest ached, but his determination burned brighter than ever. His granddaughters depended on him, and he would not let them down. "Not today," Gus muttered through gritted teeth, his voice weak but unyielding. Before Anthony could carry out his vile intentions, the police burst into the room. The hospital staff had raised the alarm after spotting the masked intruder on the surveillance cameras. Anthony was tackled to the ground and handcuffed, his reign of terror brought to an abrupt end. Anthony's arrest marked the beginning of the end for the man consumed by greed and hatred. In court, his heinous crimes were laid bare for all to see. The judge, appalled by Anthony's actions, sentenced him to 15 years in prison. But fate had other plans. 3 months into his sentence, Anthony succumbed to a severe heart condition that had plagued him for years. His passing was swift and unceremonious. Few mourned his death, and no one sang a requiem for his troubled soul. Meanwhile, Gus's life took a miraculous turn. Though the attack had left him physically weakened, his spirit remained unbroken. He poured every ounce of his love and strength into his granddaughters, who remained in a coma. Each day he sat by their beds, whispering stories, praying fervently, and holding their hands. And then, one day, his prayers were answered. It began with a faint twitch of Maisie's fingers. Then Daisy's eyelids fluttered. Gus held his breath, his heart pounding as he leaned closer. "Grandpa?" Maisie's weak voice broke the silence, her eyes slowly opening. "Maisie," Gus whispered, tears streaming down his face. "It's me. I'm here." Moments later, Daisy stirred, her voice soft but clear. "Grandpa, is it really you?" "Yes, my sweet girls," Gus sobbed, overwhelmed with joy. "It's me. You're awake. You're back." The miracle Gus had fought so hard for had finally come to pass. Against all odds, Daisy and Maisie had returned to him. Weeks after their miraculous awakening, Daisy and Maisie slowly began to heal. First, they opened their eyes, their gazes searching for familiar faces. Then came the small but determined movements, lifting their arms, gripping the bed rails, and eventually sitting up. With each passing day, their strength grew. Soon they were walking the hospital corridors on unsteady but determined feet, supported by nurses and their own willpower. Their young bodies healed rapidly, a testament to their resilience, but the same couldn't be said for Grandpa Gus. Anthony's brutal attack had left Gus bedridden, his frail body unable to recover as quickly. Despite the doctor's best efforts, he remained unconscious for weeks, his once strong spirit seemingly lost in the void. It wasn't until one quiet morning, as sunlight streamed through the hospital room window, that Gus stirred. He felt something, gentle, warm, and familiar. His eyelids fluttered open, and there they were, Daisy and Maisie, each holding one of his frail hands, their faces filled with love and relief. "Grandpa?" Maisie whispered, her voice soft but steady. "We're here now," Daisy added, tears brimming in her eyes. For the first time in weeks, Gus's spirit reawakened. Hearing their voices filled him with an indescribable joy, a feeling so pure it brought tears to his eyes. "It's our turn to take care of you," the sisters said, one after the other, as if reciting a sacred mantra. And they kept their promise. Daisy and Maisie poured their hearts into caring for Gus. They massaged his weak limbs, fed him patiently, and read to him from books and letters, their voices weaving a cocoon of comfort around him. They told him stories of their dreams and their plans for the future, painting vivid pictures of the life they wanted to share with him. For Gus, their love was like a lifeline, pulling him out of the depths of despair. Inspired by the stories he had shared about his own life, his struggles, his triumphs, and the love he had carried for them, Daisy and Maisie never wavered in their devotion. Their unwavering love ignited a new dream in Gus. "I'll walk again," he whispered one evening, his voice barely audible but filled with determination. "I'll stand on my own 2 feet. I'll hug my girls, and I'll walk with them, no matter what it takes." His dream became his driving force. Though progress was slow and painful, Gus believed with every fibre of his being that he would achieve it. Nearly a year later, on a sunny Sunday morning, Gus sat on the edge of his bed, his heart pounding with anticipation. With the help of a walker, he rose to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. Daisy and Maisie stood on either side, their hands ready to steady him. "One step at a time, Grandpa," Maisie encouraged, her voice bright with hope. "You've got this," Daisy added, her smile radiant. With a deep breath, Gus took his first independent steps in over a year. The sunlit room erupted with cheers and tears as he moved forward, each step a triumph over adversity. That day was filled with firsts. His first steps, his first hug with his granddaughters, both of them holding him tightly as though afraid to let go. His first words spoken since his illness, words of love and gratitude. His first glimpse of a life where the weight of the past no longer defined him. One thing remained unchanged. the love that had blossomed in Gus's heart the moment he first learned of his granddaughters. It was a love that burned brightly, a beacon of hope that had guided him through his darkest days. No matter what challenges lay ahead, Gus knew he would face them with courage. For as long as his heart continued to beat, he would cherish every moment with Daisy and Maisie. And as he walked hand in hand with his granddaughters under the golden sun that Sunday, Gus felt something he hadn't felt in decades: true, unshakable happiness.